This week's episode of the Religious Studies Project is brought to you by Equinox Publishing. They're offering a 25% discount on their new books, including Setting Out in the Great Way, Essays on Early Mahayana Buddhism, which is edited by Paul Harrison. Just go to equinoxpub.com and use the code RELIGION at checkout for 25% off. That's 25% off using the code RELIGION at equinoxpub.com. Here's the show. Welcome, listeners. Welcome. It's the Religious Studies Project with your good pals, Chris Cotter and David Robertson. How are you over there, David? I am incredibly tired. How are you? I'm not too bad today. Last week, worse. We've taken the recording immediately after we've both been teaching. So it's you're getting the full wonders of the Edinburgh semester right at you, listeners. Talking of Edinburgh. Yeah, exactly. We've got an interview with our Edinburgh colleague who's completing her PhD here at Edinburgh with Áine Warren. And Ross Downing spoke to her about her work on the Dark Goddess. We've heard a lot about it over the past few years whilst Áine's been with us in Edinburgh. So we're really excited that you're going to get to hear about it now. Straight over to Ross in Belfast back in September.
My name is Ross Downing. We are at BASR conference in Belfast, and I'm speaking to Áine Warren, also known as Áine Orga. She has an article in the works for the Journal of Contemporary Religion entitled Altars for the Morrigan, the legitimizing agency of a goddess in the networked flow of authority of a YouTube subculture. And under her pseudonym Áine Orga, she has 3 essays in a book independently published, edited by John Halstead, entitled Godless Paganism Voices of Non-Theistic Paganism. She has a BA in English Literature, 2 MAs, one of which is in Religious Studies from Edinburgh, where she is currently doing a PhD under the supervision of Stephen Sutcliffe. And her project, and what we're going to be talking about today, is on the Dark Goddess. So my first question is, what or who is the Dark Goddess?
Thinking about who the Dark Goddess is has really been an ongoing process through my whole PhD, because it's a title that can be used to kind of describe something quite vague, a vague idea of what the goddess is, or a type of great goddess, or more specifically to describe individual goddesses. What interested me about it was that it seemed to be used in the online pagan community to mean something quite specific, despite the fact that the title is so kind of broad. So it kind of became apparent to me that it was being used in this very particular way and associated with a journey to the Dark Goddess and a very particular kind of journey, inward journey into the inner self, that was being facilitated by this Dark Goddess figure, and that she was being associated with sort of trials and hardships during someone's life, and that the Dark Goddess experience was seen as being kind of caught up in difficult life moments and life experiences. And so that led me to kind of try and find out, well, where does this idea originate? Where does this Dark Goddess figure originate? And came across really just a handful of books, really. There's only a dozen books that I was able to find, non-fiction books, with the words The Dark Goddess in the title, that have been published since the 1990s. So I've been kind of figuring out from there and limiting myself just to those books and then to YouTube videos, which, as far as I've found, have kind of given the best understanding of, certainly within the community, of kind of contemporary paganism and sort of goddess spirituality, what the Dark Goddess is kind of within that community. There's certainly more that I could be looking at, like in online forums or Facebook or Instagram and Tumblr and so on, but I have decided to draw a line.
And how did you get into that subject? Because it is obviously a marginal, or fringe perhaps is a negative term, but it's certainly a small community. How did you come across it and what drew you to it?
I think the way I came across it initially was through a personal interest in the Irish goddess, the Morrigan. And it was kind of through, before I was actually in religious studies academically, I was encountering people online talking about the Morrigan and watching YouTube videos and so on. And so it sort of became apparent that there was quite a specific understanding of that particular deity evolving online. And I've done some previous research on that. I did my master's dissertation on a particular small community of people on the Morrigan and creating Morrigan altars. And yeah, one thing that I noticed was that she was being described as a dark goddess, and it was kind of becoming apparent that calling her a dark goddess meant something a bit more than just saying that she was a goddess and dark, that there was some sort of title of the dark goddess that was being used to describe her or to kind of contextualize her. And yeah, that was kind of how I got into it. And then kind of in the wider contemporary pagan YouTube community, there's definitely a lot of people mentioning other goddesses as being dark goddess or, part of the dark goddess.
It's interesting because it seems almost to be, rather than a specific cult or community based on, as you say, a specific dark goddess with a name. It almost seems to be in the sociology of religion. There's one idea that religion or religiosity or movements, certainly New Age movements or new religious movements, that these are perhaps languages to allow people to certainly to handle the postmodern world and a globalized world. And do you think that is a relevant description or tool to understand it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in the first instance, it's interesting that it's a name that can be used to describe the experiences of devotees of a multitude of goddesses in the first place. Is kind of the online pagan community is very much focused on people's individual solitary practices. And there's kind of this sense that if people are engaging with the dark goddess through these individual goddesses, that they can kind of relate to one another in a way that might be more difficult if they were just kind of trying to explain to each other what their individual practices are. This is kind of a way of saying, well, yes, I work with Hel, or I work with the Morrigan, I work with Kali, and this is kind of understanding that because these are under the umbrella of the dark goddess, that therefore they have a commonality and that they're kind of part of some sort of implied community. And yeah, there's definitely a sense then that there is such a specific discourse of the dark goddess that a lot can be understood just through one person saying, I work with a dark goddess or the dark goddess. A lot is implied through that. And anyone who has kind of delved into the contemporary pagan community online or on YouTube will immediately have an understanding of what that means. They'll immediately be familiar with the discourses of that community and of the dark goddess. And yeah, have that understanding that this is something that is quite focused on the female experience, quite focused even sometimes on environmental issues. That can be something that comes up, and there's just sort of this particular discourse that's being tapped into and that is being implied even just through the use of that term.
It's an interesting descriptor that she's dark. It's obviously a very loaded word descriptor, and it's obviously negative to some people, but there's also an aura of mystery and a hell of a lot of power involved in that, and it certainly seems to be an empowerment movement. Would you care to elaborate on the meanings of dark?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the time, a lot of the different understandings of what the dark goddess is really tied up in what people's understanding of the word dark means and the implications of that. I will mention briefly just the question of skin color and dark skin. That's something that gets referenced very occasionally. People will interpret the dark goddess as meaning a goddess with dark skin, but I would say that across the literature that I'm looking at, that's not what's intended at all. But it is something that gets kind of picked up sometimes, and I think maybe perhaps misinterpreted occasionally, that this is kind of a weird appropriation of a dark-skinned goddess, sometimes seen as being Kali primarily, but that definitely is not the primary understanding here. There's definitely an understanding that dark is a part maybe of nature broadly that is being, or that has kind of historically been relegated from society generally, but also from religious practices, that it's been seen as something that is not to be approached, not to be encouraged, that's not to be approached within the self as well. And so the dark is definitely seen as something that can be interpreted as being negative, or certainly that is difficult in some way. It's the dark is kind of the difficult parts of the self, the parts of the self that are maybe destructive and so on, but also it's seen as something that is very necessary to kind of the cycles of nature and to just kind of the ups and downs of life and of the personality and so on. So it's definitely seen as as necessary to any kind of holistic understanding of the self and also just of nature and much more widely.
When you mentioned the goddess Kali, the great Vivian Crowley was in the audience at your presentation and asked specifically about the types of people that are drawn to the dark goddess or participating or contributing to this idea. Have you looked at the wider historiographical development of the goddess? Like what countries did it seem to develop from? Is there any specific movements that have been connected to this? I mean, who are these people and what draws them to, what motivates them?
Yeah. I mean, because the numbers are so small, it's a little bit difficult to make generalizations. I would say, I mean, similarly to the kind of contemporary pagan demographic generally online, the majority of the voices are they are white women from either America or from Britain, mostly speaking. There are some Australians in there as well. There always are some Australians in there, and some of the books as well definitely been written by some Australians. But there is a little bit of diversity. I certainly remember there was at least one black woman in the YouTube videos, and then there are a couple of Indians as well, specifically related to Kali. And when I first started doing the research, I actually expected that there might be two different threads going on, that there might be one thread of sort of the white Westerners' dark goddess, which would be emerging in kind of the books that weren't specifically associated with Kali, and that there was going to be something slightly different going on with the books that were written specifically about Kali as the dark goddess. But interestingly, I discovered once I started analysing the texts that it was largely the same kind of discourse emerging across the board, and that those texts were kind of engaging with maybe not the contemporary pagan kind of milieu, but certainly with kind of goddess spirituality. So generally speaking, the same kind of idea seems to be arising across the board and connected to, very roughly speaking, to kind of Jungian psychology. So it is quite a diverse span of people, really, but again, a little bit difficult to make generalizations based just on the amount of data that I've been looking at. I think to delve into that further, I would be wanting to kind of look at, probably more look at the viewers of the videos and to look maybe at Facebook groups and so on to kind of get a wider range of, a greater number of practitioners to kind of make any generalizations from.
You mentioned Jung and Jungian psychology there, and in new religious movements, or certainly new age movements, there seems to be an element of therapy involved in these things. Jungian psychology and therapy seem to go together. So, how do they consciously apply that?
Yeah, Jung is a figure who just sort of floats in the background of all of this, and I find that he tends to be present kind of across the board in these communities, and but he's kind of evoked, but then not really addressed, and there's no kind of direct line drawn really between the books, and sometimes there's even overt statements made of that we're talking about the shadow, but we're not talking about Jungian practices. But there's a definite therapeutic element to the practices and to even just the way that the dark goddess is talked about. So there is this sense that that the dark goddess is something that can be used, or an entity that can be used or invited into the individual in order to really to kind of improve one's well-being. But I would say that the focus is really not so much just on focusing on one's kind of how well the individual is performing in society, or just their kind of physical or mental well-being. There's kind of always this kind of wider implication that interacting with the dark goddess or having a dark goddess experience, that kind of as a side effect, these good things will happen, and the person will have a kind of an improved sense of wellness. But widely speaking, it's a much kind of deeper and broader question, and kind of seen as being this much kind of bigger picture necessary step, that there's something that's kind of something deep and important about the human experience, and about kind of our understanding of nature, and kind of a disjoint between the human and nature, and that encountering and working with the dark goddess is going to heal that on some kind of basic level. So it kind of transcends any sort of personal therapy and goes kind of beyond into some much kind of bigger picture idea of what needs to be solved kind of in the world.
The aspect of being dark sounds quite, not just spooky, but quite scary. And from the data that you presented, that seems to be something that they're consciously aware of, almost like this daredevil aspect, or perhaps even picking up on cultures, say like Candomblé, that focus on possession. One of the bits of data that I picked up on that you presented was when one of these writers said that someone was not really looking her in the eye. And that sounds to me a very, very powerful visual thing there. I think Rudolf Otto dealt with that in the idea of the divine being tremendum et fascinans, that the deity that you're in contact with is both fascinating, you're drawn to it, but it also instills a sense of terror. So what's going on here? Is it that kind of Ottonian duality there? Or
Yes, very much so. There's very much a sense kind of across the board that, if one is interacting with a divine entity of some kind and there isn't this sense of almost fear or discomfort, that something is lacking, that there's something that's not being contacted, or that there's something not quite authentic about that experience. And this is particularly so with the dark goddess. Like, there's kind of a sense that, if you want to do something nice and easy and light, then you can kind of go and talk to some other goddess. But if you want to talk to the dark goddess, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be a bit spooky, and that's just how she is. But I think there's also a sense that this is saying something about authentic religion in general, and that in order to be truly authentic as a spiritual person, that you need to be encountering the dark goddess. And that is kind of sometimes explicitly stated, that if you're not having dark goddess experiences or interacting with that kind of essence, that there's something kind of crucial about divinity and about the nature of existence that's being missed and that's not being addressed. And that's a really common theme across the board, and kind of ties into that idea of in order to kind of have a holistic self or a holistic understanding of the nature of cosmos, that the dark goddess has to be encountered and has to be acknowledged and it has to be embraced.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people that are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it'd be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
I think it's really exciting topics that you're bringing up here, generally for the study of religion, because you mentioned that there's an ambiguity of ontology. It's really fascinating that they're awakening or searching for an authentic self inside them, and at the same time, say, inviting something in from the outside. That seems to me to have great potential to be applied to religious studies theory in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of like the sense that if in this community, and it's definitely reflected, I've seen anyway, in some other pagan communities and other contemporary spiritual communities, if there's this sense that religion, spirituality, or the divine, that is primarily something that's been contacted within the self, it kind of almost negates the question of its reality, or whether it needs to be, or whether there's any need for it to be kind of authorized by science or by a scientific paradigm. So it kind of very interestingly allows the people in this community to kind of to buy into a couple of different kinds of authority, and that there's no need for them to negate science or a scientific paradigm that they've been raised in order to really see the importance or the kind of efficacy of this practice, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, you said there's a key word that I picked up on that I really liked. You talked about interiorization. It became apparent as you were discussing it that you weren't talking about internalization. That internalization seems to be, as I understood from what you were saying, is perhaps just an act or a method in an overall doctrine of focus on the interior. Could you talk more about the dichotomy or the difference between the interior and the internal?
Yeah, I guess again it kind of comes down to that idea of whether the religious practice in question is really about just focusing on something inside the self to the detriment of something outside the self, versus that the religious or spiritual practice in question is more about taking the interior as the kind of mode of interpretation of something that is understood to not just be within but also be without. So that then the kind of subjective experience of what they're doing and what they're looking at in the world kind of becomes a way of reinterpreting, a way of understanding their surroundings. And this kind of ties into the idea of the dark goddess being something that is both simultaneously within and outside of the self. So it kind of, I think it kind of breaks down that barrier then of the question of whether divinity is something that is, purely in the mind, or that it's purely a metaphor or an archetype or something that isn't real, versus something that is real outside in the world and that needs to be kind of found outside of the self. It's almost like this alternative version of reality that can be viewed from this particular kind of internalized understanding of reality.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's a difficult
it's
situation.
it's very difficult to
That's
express.
what I think is so fascinating with religious studies, because there's this constant pursuit in terminology to try and find different ways of expressing the inexpressible. Yeah. And when you look at a community that is trying to do that without academic language, it's almost like, maybe they know something that we don't.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a lot of your data involves YouTube and social media, because it's obviously a really good tool for people in new religious movements. I'm interested and concerned that there's a lot of women putting themselves out there, talking about very personal things, which are probably open to ridicule. What kind of reception have they had? I mean, trolls and the alt-right and all sorts.
Yeah, absolutely. On the videos that I've been analysing, there are no kind of negative comments to be found on those videos. Generally speaking, the community is very kind of affirmative, and the people who are commenting, or at least the comments that are left for the public to see, are from people, like-minded people, usually women who are kind of have had similar experiences. But you don't have to scratch the surface too much to see that there definitely is a certain amount of issues with that kind of behaviour in the community. I'm part of one group where I've seen a conversation very recently of people expressing concerns about their YouTube channels, about continuing with their YouTube channels, women who are feeling uncomfortable because they've witnessed other women in the community experiencing really terrible trolling behaviour to the point of being stalked or harassed. And it's always kind of there under the surface. Generally, it gets dealt with by people just blocking, deleting the comments. So kind of there isn't a culture of it being out in the open and being able to kind of read the horrible comments that are being left under these videos, because they tend to be just deleted and blocked. But it's definitely there under the surface. It's definitely something that the YouTubers encounter, in particularly I think female YouTubers. Yeah.
It does really sound quite, part of the zeitgeist then, really, of what's going on at the moment in Western society. Well, even Eastern countries. You've got the Hindu movement in India, where there's just this rise of intolerance and the new right, which is almost becoming established and institutionalized. So seems like this, even though it's a small happening in a small community, it has a much greater, it's perhaps a litmus test for massive social relevance and social movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's across the board, the question of feminism outright gets dealt with in different ways, I would say, in the texts, in the books, and in the YouTube videos. Sometimes it's not a word that's really raised at all, and some of the women will kind of say, "Oh, you know, we're not saying that men are a problem, or we're not, you know, kind of rallying against the idea of the patriarchy." But really, across the board, it's the Dark Goddess movement is very much a feminist one, and very much. Sometimes just outright discussing the problem of the patriarchy and so on and so forth. So it's definitely a movement. I can understand why it's kind of still being, still kind of maybe on the rise. I would say that certainly the Morrigan is an increasingly popular goddess. So there's this, while it is a very small community, there's definitely this sense that it's reflecting something that's happening in kind of broader society.
So where do you go from here now with your research? Obviously, you've got publications coming out, and you've got your website, which is a mix of academic and more free expressionism. But once you've done your PhD and things, and as we said there, you know, there's so much material in here that you've got feminism and theory of religion. You know, political relevance. So you're just going to see where the next step is, and then go from.
I'm kind of on the fence at the moment. I may branch out and do something completely different beyond the PhD. I haven't completely decided. I have been considering doing something that's not necessarily within pagan studies, because one question that I was asked, or maybe I just brought it up during my paper, was about fieldwork and whether, you know, the question of doing interviews and so on. And I think if I was going to continue down this line of research, I would want to be broadening my field of data by doing some sort of interviewing or something along those lines, some fieldwork. And it's something that I've always been uncomfortable about doing because of my role within the community, because of the kind of insider-outsider problem, because as Áine Warren, I am a figure in the pagan community, and certainly within the Dark Goddess movement. Anyone who is online talking about the Morrigan has probably come across me, and so I kind of get this sense that there's already this sense that the community maybe has a lot of trust in me, and I've always been afraid of kind of abusing that trust in some way, that people might say things to me or might open up about things or share things with me without necessarily realizing that I've got my academic hat on, and without necessarily wanting me to use that kind of in my academic publication. So I think, I may branch out. I may do something a little bit different in the future, but I have to wait and see. Get the PhD finished first.
There's so much food for thought here. Thank you, soon to be Dr. Áine Warren.
Thank you.
So we're out of the way back machine. We're back to Edinburgh today. Great to hear that. And I think we said this before, but Ross volunteered to do some interviews and took it. He had an idea. He wanted to interview some younger scholars, earlier career scholars, probably better to say, which is great for us. So I hope you enjoyed that one.
Yeah. I think something that was cut out of our last podcast due to technical issues and then re-recording, you'll remember we were recording across the North Sea last time, was to mention we've passed 5,000 followers on Facebook. So thank you to everyone. It's delicious to see how much that's grown.
That is, absolutely fantastic. And a reminder of how important kind of social media remains for many people, despite the current, complaints.
Exactly. Another thing that we like to remind you about often is our Patreon subscription. You can sign up for a regular, very minimal commitment on Patreon. And you get some bonus content. Also, if your department sponsors the podcast, you get some bonus content. And Well, we might play some of that for you now. What is it, David?
Well, this is a clip from we've got a couple of different shows. We've mentioned Discourse before, which is our kind of current affairs take on, religion in the news, and I'm doing the quote marks around religion. But this is a clip from Are You My Data, which is our kind of interview format where we speak to scholars as people. And very fitting that the first person on it is Carol Cusack, one of the RSP's biggest fan, as well as our Christmas special champion. So here's a little clip from Carol speaking to me.
What I usually say nowadays to people is if you really, 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 really want a career, you just have to understand that you can't give up. You will let attrition get rid of the other people. They will fall by the wayside. And eventually, somewhere between 40 and 45, you might get a job. Well, I got a job when I was 35, so it was earlier. But I did. I saw out a lot of other people who gave up and became depressed and decided that academia wasn't for them. And I did a lot of things that I probably shouldn't have done. And just in case you think that's going to point to some kind of amazing sex scandal or not, it isn't. What I'm going to say is that now, as an ardent supporter of the academic union in Australia, the National Tertiary Education Union, I tell students not to do things that they're not paid for. But for many, many, many years, I picked up after people. I made coffee. I still sort mail, book rooms, fill photocopiers with paper, do incredible numbers of footling chores that I shouldn't actually have to do. And it's partly because when you're in a small embattled area, the front presented to the world must be seamless. Everything must work. And that usually means doing an awful lot of stuff that actually isn't part of your job. And you just have to suck on it. That's how it is.
Wonderful to hear that, David. I know I haven't heard the whole thing yet, and I'm going to have to go right on to the special patrons area.
Type in some of your questions in
secret code. Yeah, good.
So, also, if you've enjoyed Are You My Data, we've got another one coming up with Russell McCutcheon in a week or two. And if you have suggestions for other people that we can speak to, please email us at editors@religiousstudiesproject.com. And we'll be soliciting for more questions for future episodes very soon.
Yeah. So don't forget to come back later in the week for the usual podcast response. The role has been ably taken over by Rebecca Barrett-Fox and Marek Sullivan. So we've been enjoying those responses trickling out. And then don't forget a new podcast for you next week. It's my conversation with Carmen Becker about the secular and the religious and the construction of the category refugee in contemporary Germany. So a very topical but also critical podcast.
And great to hear from our European colleagues as ever.
What else do we always say as ever? Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank for
listening.
The
RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.